In November 2018, the National Gallery in London acquired a single painting for the unprecedented sum of £3.6 million. It was the most the gallery had ever paid for a work by a woman artist. The painting was small, a self-portrait, just under 2 feet square of a 17th century woman dressed as Saint Catherine of Alexandria, with a martyr's palm in one hand and her other hand resting on the broken wheel of her torture. The painter was Artemisia Gentileschi, born 1593, died around 1656. In her own lifetime, she was the most successful female painter in Europe, a court artist to the Medici, to Charles I of England, and to Philip IV of Spain, and the first woman ever admitted to the Florentine Accademia delle del Disegno. Then for nearly 300 years, she was almost completely forgotten, her paintings reattributed to her father, to her male contemporaries, or simply ignored as the work of a talented amateur. What happened between 1656 and 1916 is one of the most damning case studies in how art historical scholarship can erase a major figure, not through deliberate suppression, but through a kind of casual disregard that, once it sets in, takes generations to undo. This is the story of a woman who painted some of the most powerful religious and history paintings of the 17th century, was raped as a teenager, and testified against her assailant under torture, won a major career-defining court case in Rome, traveled across half of Europe to satisfy royal commissions, and was then quietly written out of the canon by a 19th century art establishment that could not imagine that a woman might have painted what they were looking at. Artemisia Gentileschi was born in Rome on the 8th of July, 1593. Her father, Orazio Gentileschi, was a Tuscan-born painter who had moved to Rome in his late 20s and become one of the leading followers of Caravaggio in the city. Orazio was a fairly successful but not first-rank Roman painter. He had a busy workshop, regular church commissions, and a network of patrons that included some of the major Roman families. His 4 children were all expected to learn the trade. 3 sons, Francesco, Marco, and Giulio, would all become workshop assistants and minor painters in their own right. Artemisia, the eldest child and the only surviving daughter, was, by every contemporary account, the most talented of the 4. By the time she was 17, she was a more skilled painter than any of her brothers. In 1610, at age 17, Artemisia completed Susanna and the Elders, her first signed and dated painting. The composition shows the biblical Susanna being accosted by 2 elderly judges while bathing. Artemisia's treatment is unlike any prior version of the subject in Italian painting. Susanna is rendered as a real, anatomically specific young woman in a posture of genuine physical revulsion, her body twisting away from the looming men with a recoil that earlier versions of the subject, often painted by male artists as a kind of sanctioned erotic image, had not depicted. The painting was, by every modern art historical assessment, more accomplished than anything Orazio Gentileschi had produced at the same age. It was the work of a major painter at 17. In May 1611, Orazio invited a fellow painter named Agostino Tassi into his household to give Artemisia private painting lessons. Specifically in perspective, a technical skill in which Tassi specialized. Tassi was, in Roman terms, a notorious figure. He had been accused of attempting to arrange the murder of his wife. He was rumored to have committed multiple sexual assaults. He had a long police record. Orazio, by hiring him, may have been making a practical decision. Tassi was available, cheap, and reportedly skilled, without fully understanding the danger to his daughter. In the same May, Tassi raped Artemisia. After the assault, Tassi promised Artemisia he would marry her, the standard 17th century social rectification for the rape of an unmarried woman, which would restore her family's honor. Artemisia, with no other legal recourse available to her, accepted the arrangement and continued to have a sexual relationship with Tassi on the premise that the marriage would follow. Tassi did not, in fact, intend to marry her. He was already married to another woman, a fact he had concealed from Artemisia and her father, when the deception was uncovered 9 months later, in March 1612. Orazio Gentileschi filed a formal criminal complaint against Tassi in the papal court. The trial took place between March and November 1612. The court records survive in their entirety in the Archivio di Stato in Rome. They are among the most extraordinary documents in 17th century European legal history. Artemisia testified about the rape in detail. Tassi denied everything. He claimed Artemisia was a known prostitute, that she had had affairs with multiple men, that her painting was actually her father's work, that she had falsely accused him because she was sexually frustrated. Witnesses were called. Tassi's own friends and associates testified that he had bragged about the assault to them. The most disturbing element of the trial, by modern standards, is what the court did to verify Artemisia's testimony. Under standard Roman papal court procedure of the early 17th century, a witness's testimony could be tested for truthfulness through the application of a form of judicial torture called the Sibyl. The accused or witness's fingers were bound with cords that were progressively tightened, applying crushing pressure to the joints. The legal theory was that someone who continued to maintain the same testimony under physical torture must be telling the truth. Artemisia testified under Sibyl. Her fingers, the fingers of a painter, were crushed in the cords while she repeated her account of the rape under oath. The transcript records her words, "It is true, it is true, it is true. Then questo è l'anello che mi dai, e questo sono le promesse. This is the ring you give me, and these are the promises." The Sibyl testimony was decisive. The court found Tassi guilty in November 1612. He was sentenced to either 5 years of exile from Rome or 2 years of imprisonment at his choice. Tassi chose exile but never actually left Rome. He was, within months, granted an effective pardon by the Pope. He continued to live and work in Rome until his death in 1644. Tassi suffered no real consequence for raping Artemisia. The trial's primary practical effect was on Artemisia herself, a young unmarried woman who had testified publicly about her own assault, in a Roman society where such a public statement was, by itself, a severe blow to her family's social reputation. 1 month after the trial verdict, Orazio arranged for Artemisia to be married to a minor Florentine painter named Pier Antonio Stiazzi. The marriage was a hasty social rectification. Pier Antonio was an unimpressive artist a few years older than Artemisia. With no significant career of his own, the marriage was an arrangement to get Artemisia out of Rome and to give her, formally, the social status of a married woman. They moved to Florence within months of the wedding. Florence in 1612 was ruled by the Medici. Grand Duke Cosimo II de' Medici, in his early 20s, in poor health, but a serious art patron, had assembled a court of leading Italian artists and intellectuals. Galileo Galilei was the Medici court mathematician. Michelangelo Buonarroti, the younger, the great-nephew of the sculptor and a literary figure in his own right, was a courtier and playwright. Artemisia, freshly arrived from Rome with a reputation as a painter and the daughter of one of the leading Caravaggioists, was immediately welcomed into the Medici cultural orbit. Within months of arriving, Artemisia received her first major Medici commission. By 1614, she had been formally introduced to the court and was painting for the Grand Duke himself. By 1616, she was admitted to the Accademia delle Arti del Disegno, the most prestigious artistic academy in Italy, founded by Vasari in 1563. She was the first woman ever admitted to the Accademia in its 53-year history. The admission was not a token gesture. It granted Artemisia full member rights, the ability to sign her own contracts and receive payments directly, without her husband as intermediary, and the legal standing to operate as an independent artist in Florence. In the surviving Accademia records, her admission is documented with the same formal language as that of male artists. Between 1614 and 1620, Artemisia produced some of her most famous and powerful paintings. The 2 versions of Judith beheading Holofernes, now in the Uffizi in Florence and the Capodi Monte in Naples, date from this period. The Uffizi version in particular is one of the most visceral biblical paintings in Italian Baroque art. The Old Testament heroine Judith and her maidservant Abra restraining and decapitating the Assyrian general Holofernes, with blood spraying across the white sheets and the women's expressions showing not horror or ecstasy, but focused, deliberate competence at a physically demanding task. Modern critics have, predictably, read the Judith paintings as Artemisia's psychological response to her own assault and trial. Some have argued that the figure of Holofernes resembles Agostino Tassi, that the violence in the painting is Artemisia's revenge on her assailant in pigment. I think this reading is partially correct, but should be approached with caution. Artemisia was a working painter executing commissions for patrons. The Judith subject was one of the most popular biblical history painting commissions of the early 17th century. Caravaggio had painted it. Her father had painted it. Cristofano Allori was painting it at the same time in Florence. Artemisia's treatment of the subject is unique not because of any single psychological correspondence, but because she renders it with an anatomical and physical specificity that male painters of the same scene had not attempted. Judith's grip on Holofernes' head, the angle of the sword, the muscular tension in Abra's shoulders as she holds him down. All of these are rendered as work being done, not as theatrical violence. It is the difference between a painting of a beheading and a painting of two women actually beheading a man. The latter is what Artemisia painted. Whether or not she was thinking about Tassi, she was thinking about how the scene would have actually unfolded in a way that her male contemporaries were not. By 1620, Artemisia had separated from her husband Pier Antonio. The marriage had produced 4 children, only one of whom, a daughter named Prudenzia, survived to adulthood. Pier Antonio had run up substantial gambling debts in Florence using Artemisia's earnings as an artist. Artemisia, with her independent professional standing through the Accademia, ultimately broke with him and moved to Rome around 1620. In Rome between 1620 and 1626, Artemisia maintained a thriving studio. She painted private collectors' commissions, religious altarpieces, and history paintings. She traveled to Venice for some months in 1626, where she met and was influenced by Venetian painters, including Tintoretto's Circle. Around 1630, she relocated to Naples, where she would spend the rest of her career. Naples in 1630 was the second largest city in Europe and a major art market under Spanish viceregal rule. Caravaggio had spent his last years there. Giuseppe de Ribera was the dominant living painter in the city. The market was vast and patrons numerous. In Naples, Artemisia operated one of the city's leading workshops. She trained assistants, took on apprentices, and signed multiple commissions per year. Surviving records show payments to her from the Spanish viceregal court, from major Neapolitan families, and from monastery commissions. She also corresponded extensively with patrons across Italy and Europe. Her surviving letters, which have been collected and published in modern editions, document her negotiations over prices, her insistence on being paid in advance for materials, and her sharp commercial intelligence in handling difficult patrons. In 1638, Artemisia traveled to London at the invitation of King Charles I of England. Her father, Orazio, had moved to London some years before to serve as a court painter to Charles. But his health was failing. Artemisia joined him in London. The two collaborated on a major decorative cycle of canvases for the Queen's House at Greenwich, a project on which Artemisia's contribution has, until recent decades, been almost entirely effaced from the art historical record. Orazio died in London in February 1639. Artemisia remained in London for at least another year, completing commissions for Charles I and members of the English court, before returning to Naples around 1640. The English Civil War broke out in 1642. Charles I would be executed in 1649. The English Royal Collection, including most of the paintings by both Gentileschi, was dispersed in the so-called sale of the king's goods between 1649 and 1651, after which many of the Gentileschi paintings disappeared into European collections and were subsequently reattributed. Artemisia Gentileschi died in Naples sometime around 1656. The exact date is uncertain. The last documented payment to her dates from 1654. She would have been about 63. Naples experienced a major plague epidemic in 1656 that killed roughly half the city's population, and many art historians believe she likely died in that plague. Though her death is not specifically recorded, at the time of her death, Artemisia Gentileschi was one of the most successful painters in Europe. Her paintings hung in royal palaces in London, Madrid, Florence, Naples, and Rome. She was known by name across the major Italian art collecting cities, and then almost immediately she began to disappear from art history. The disappearance happened in 3 stages. Stage 1, between 1656 and 1750, Artemisia was simply omitted from the major 17th and 18th century biographical compendia that defined the art historical canon for the next 200 years. Filippo Baldinucci, 1681 to 1728. Notizie da Professore del Disegno. The standard reference for Italian Baroque painters includes Orazio Gentileschi as a major entry, but mentions Artemisia only in passing as his daughter, also a painter. Pellegrino Antonio Orlandi's 1719 Episterio Pittorico mentions her briefly. Roger de Piles's Abrege de la Vie des Peintres, 1699, omits her entirely. When art historians in the 19th century went to construct the canon of major Baroque painters, they read these compendia. Artemisia, having been minimized at the moment of her death, stayed minimized. Stage 2. As paintings by Artemisia entered the European art market in the 18th and 19th centuries, through estate sales, monastery dissolutions, and reattribution by dealers, they were systematically reassigned. A Gentileschi signature on a major canvas was, by default, assumed to be Orazio's, since Orazio was the documented major painter. A Caravaggesque painting from the Neapolitan school was, by default, attributed to one of the male Caravaggisti, Massimo Stanzione, Bernardo Cavallino, even Caravaggio himself. The presumption was systematic. A painting that was clearly major and Caravaggesque must have been by a male artist, because women were not, in the 19th century art historians' mental world, capable of major painting. Stage 3. By the early 20th century, when Artemisia did appear in art historical literature at all, she appeared as a curiosity. The Italian critic Roberto Longhi, who, as we have seen in the Caravaggio context, was the most important rediscoverer of Italian Baroque painting in the early 20th century, published a major article on Artemisia in 1916. The article was titled Gentileschi, Father and Daughter. Longhi treated Artemisia seriously and gave her credit for paintings that had been misattributed. But he also wrote in the article's most cited passage that Artemisia was the only woman in Italy who knew what painting was in color and impasto and similar essentials. The Longhi article, generous by 1916 standards, still framed Artemisia as a singular exception, a freakish accomplishment. It implicitly endorsed the idea that women were not capable of major painting, and that Artemisia was the rare anomaly who, somehow, was. The full rediscovery of Artemisia Gentileschi was a project of the second half of the 20th century. It happened in 3 waves. Wave 1, in 1947, Roberto Longhi's wife, the art historian Anna Banti, published a novel titled Artemisia. The novel was a fictionalized biography drawing on the 1612 trial transcripts and on the surviving paintings. Banti, who had lost her own academic manuscript on Artemisia in the wartime bombing of Florence, wrote the novel partly as an act of reconstruction. The novel introduced Artemisia Gentileschi to a non-academic Italian readership for the first time in 300 years. Wave 2, beginning in the 1972, second-wave feminist art historians, particularly Mary Garrard, an American scholar based at American University in Washington, began systematic archival research into Artemisia, Garrard's monumental 1989 monograph Artemisia Gentileschi. The image of the female hero in Italian Baroque, art reconstructed Artemisia's career on the basis of the surviving primary documents, attributed dozens of misattributed paintings back to her, and made the argument that she was not a freakish exception to the male canon, but a major painter who had been systematically erased. Garrard's work was foundational. Subsequent scholars, particularly Judith Mann, Meek Ball, R. Ward Bissell, and Sheila Barker, continued the archival and attributional research. By 2001, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and the St. Louis Art Museum mounted the first major museum exhibition dedicated to Artemisia, Orazio, and Artemisia Gentileschi for the first time in over 3 centuries. The works of father and daughter were displayed in dedicated proximity, allowing critics to see how Artemisia's accomplishment had exceeded Orazio's at almost every point in her career. The exhibition was a critical success. It established Artemisia as a major Baroque painter in the consensus academic literature. Wave 3. From 2002 to the present, Artemisia has been the subject of major retrospective exhibitions at the Pitti Palace in Florence, the Musée Maillol in Paris, the National Gallery in London, the Detroit Institute of Arts, and most recently a major touring exhibition organized by the National Gallery in London in 2020. Attribution research has continued. Several previously unidentified paintings have been added to her catalogue raison. The Burlington magazine has published a steady stream of new attributions. In 2018, the National Gallery in London acquired Artemisia's self-portrait as Saint Catherine of Alexandria for £3.6 million, a record price at the time for any work by a female old master. The acquisition was funded by a public crowdfunding campaign that raised over £1,000 from small donors combined with major grants from the Heritage Lottery Fund and the American Friends of the National Gallery. The National Gallery framed the acquisition as a deliberate corrective. An institution that had not, for almost 200 years of its existence, acquired a major work by a woman old master was making an explicit historical statement. The Artemisia Gentileschi story is, in its full arc, an instructive case study in how the art historical canon is actually constructed. The canon is not, as is sometimes imagined, an objective record of artistic quality. It is the cumulative result of biographical attention, attribution decisions, market transactions, and institutional collecting policies over many generations. When a painter has powerful patrons, when biographers include her in their compendia, when dealers attribute paintings to her name rather than to a male alternative, and when museums acquire and exhibit her work, she ends up in the canon. When all of those processes work in the opposite direction, as they did for Artemisia between roughly 1656 and 1916, a painter, even a major one, can be effectively deleted. Artemisia's rediscovery does not, in my view, validate any one critical theory. It is not the case that her paintings were better than Orazio's because she was a woman, or that she should be celebrated only because she was a woman. Her paintings were better than Orazio's because she was a more talented painter. They are major works of Italian Baroque art regardless of who painted them. The disturbing fact is that this was not obvious to the art historical establishment until very recently, and that the establishment had to be argued with through archival research, through feminist scholarship, through exhibition curation, through public campaigns, before it would correct the record. We can be reasonably confident that there are other Artemisia Gentileschis whose work has been similarly misattributed and forgotten. Recent scholarship has begun to bring back painters like Sofonisba, Anguissola, Lavinia Fontana, Elisabetta Serrani, and Judith Lisser, each of whom had distinguished careers in their own lifetimes and was then effectively erased. The list of male artist names that should probably be reduced or removed from the catalog is, conversely, also longer than the establishment has so far acknowledged. The canon is being slowly, painfully, partially corrected. It is, however, taking a remarkable amount of effort to do. Artemisia Gentileschi died in Naples around 1656 as one of the most successful painters in Europe. It took 360 years for the art world to fully remember that.